Although this happened many years ago, I remember that awful day as if it were yesterday.
When I was 6 years old, I ended up in an Indian residential school. I spent 10 lost years of my life there.
Knowing what I know now, I wish that I had hidden so that they could not have found me.
My guest this evening is Robert Wells, author of the book Wawahte, whose trailer you have just seen. Good evening, Robert.
Good evening.
Before we get into the thick of the book, I'd like you to explain why it is that you ended up being the author of this book.
Well, it has a lot to do with where I grew up in the 1940s. When I stepped out of what I thought to be at that time my white Christian household, I lived in the native world, and I had a dear friend who I called Moochum Joe, who I visited about every day. And he asked me, if not once, but many hundreds of times, that when the time was right, that I was to tell my kind how bad Indian people were being treated.
And how do you feel about being the voice of Native people to the white man? How do you feel about that?
I feel honored. We all live here in the country of Canada, and it's not their problem any more than it's ours, if there are problems, which there are many. So I don't think that anybody should have priority on telling of a dark chapter of our history.
Now, in this book, you interview three survivors of Indian residential schools, and they each tell very sad stories. What, in your view, is the worst thing about their sad story?
The thing that I find the most disturbing, because I knew about it as a child because some of my friends were
carted off to
residential schools, was the fact that they were taken from their families, put into an institution, which was very much like a jail, and subjected to all sorts of rules and regulations that was totally foreign to them, not being able to speak their own native languages for the most part. That wasn't always the case, but most often it was. And just losing their culture. It was a crime to have been born, as they would say at that time, being born an Indian.
Bob, I was very moved reading your book about the story of Esther and how she gets to school and what happens to her when she gets there.
Well, Esther grew up 60 miles north of the railroad, never saw a train or heard a train until she was about 6 years old. And one day, a man came and rounded up about 25 children in the in the community that they were living, and got on the train, and she hugged her parents goodbye and her grandparents, and went off to residential school. And arrived very early in the morning.
After crying all night.
After crying all night, and they even had to put guards at the door to keep the older boys and girls that had been there before from jumping off the train. And the next morning, somebody came and asked her what her name was, and she told the person in Cree that her name was Esther, and got slapped in the face, and that was the first time in her life that an adult had ever struck her.
That was the first time in your life an adult had ever struck her?
Yes.
Because?
It's a cultural taboo for an adult to strike children. And you think, well, maybe there isn't, how do you discipline? I've grown up with these people, and it's marvelous how they could distract them to make the little boy put the axe down, but wouldn't take it away from him.
What should we think of the way this is progressing now, with apologies from the federal government, apologies from all the churches that were involved, except for the Roman Catholic Church, which still has refused to apologize? Where does that leave the survivors of residential schools? Are they reckoning with the past? Are they able to forgive? Where does that leave them?
Well, there's been a great deal of effort through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where the whole conferences, people are invited to come and to tell their stories. It's part of a healing process. But I think even it goes well beyond that. It isn't their problem alone, it's our problem. And that I think we have to be aware of it. We can't go back and change the history, but we can do things and live differently and at least have a friendly relationship.
What is it we should be aware of about the harms of residential schools?
There is no real simple answer, but there were 7 generations of children taken from their parents who never learned to be parents. We learn to be parents from our parents, and they go home and they raise their children not knowing how to be parents themselves because they didn't learn it.
They didn't have parents.
They didn't have parents. They were institutionalized. And they live in communities that we put them onto Indian reserves, made them welfare dependent, took away their economic base, and then we often say, well, why don't you just forget it and move on? Well, the post-generational impacts are incredibly difficult to overcome, and it's not their problem, it's our problem.
How do we solve this problem of children who became adults, who have children of their own, but who were never parented, who don't know how to parent? How do we solve that problem? 7 generations of people who did not learn to be parents.
Everybody looks for a simple answer. There isn't. I think one of the things that we have to do is begin respecting one another. And when sometimes if your people are dealing with First Nations and you find that they are reluctant to engage with you, it's because they don't trust you, and why should they trust you? Mm-hmm. So I really truly believe that the answer lies in the children, our children, and if you bring the schooling standards up to provincial and territorial standards, and give them a good school environment and help them build home environments. It will help. It's going to take a long time. It was like I heard an elder say one time, if it takes 7 days to walk into the forest, it's going to take you 7 days to walk out.
Right. So the strategy now is to obviously keep children at home and teach them in their native language to the extent that that's possible. So it's a reversal of the forced integration that was the premise of residential schools.
Yes.
Now, does that not cause its own set of problems in the sense of if you move away from forced integration to no integration at all, that's not obviously better?
It's very difficult. We have First Nations, people living in with First Nation status who wants to be exclusive. Well, the rest of the world wants to become inclusive, and I think for the most part, most of us are looking for some simple answer. I don't know where the answer is, and I think that the answer is going to come through many hours of discussion and one-on-one conversations with people, and we're all different, and some kids are going to do well in school, and some kids are not, but in many of these communities there is no steady employment. There's no work.
There's a passage in this book where one of the people you interview talks about the decline of the fur industry.
Yes.
And how the decline of the fur industry propelled a middle class of First Nations into destitute poverty. Now, this suggests that one solution is to rebuild the local economy where people can earn their livings from the perspective of reserves and so on, as opposed to integrating in the city and losing their cultural identities by integrating
Yes.
fully.
And also that it's a personal choice. You know, these people should have the choice to remain on their traditional lands. They should be able to access the wealth that's being taken from the lands, whether it's in mining or in timber. All those things have been denied to these people.
Mm-hmm. One tidbit that struck me as I read the book is that whenever you use the word Indian, you put it in quotes.
Yes.
And I think Canadians are confused about the status of this word because all the official documents refer to Canadian Indians. I've heard Native people say that they prefer to be called Indians.
Bunny in the book prefers to be called Indian.
So why the quotes around Indian? Why the unhappiness about just using the term?
Well, I'm sure that when Christopher Columbus arrived in wherever he landed in North America, it didn't take him more than a couple of days to figure out he wasn't in the suburbs of Bombay. But because they looked like Indian people, because we'd been trekking off to India for centuries, they called them Indians, and they're not. They're Mohawk, they're Ojibwe, they're Anishinaabe, they're Cree, Oji-Cree, and you can go on and on and on. And there is distinct in their culture as the French, the Irish, the Chinese.
Right, right.
And so I intentionally misspelled Indian on the back of the audiobook. And
how did you misspell it?
I just put an extra I in it.
I see. Okay. Well, so you're going to have a signing of this book. Tell our audience when that will be.
This will be the second time we'll be doing a book signing at Chapters on March the 8th between noon and 4 o'clock. It's on a Sunday, and invite you all out to that.
Okay.
And
well, I'll invite our audience to read your book. It's a very touching book, and I'm sure that we all have a lot to learn by reading
Yes,
it.
yes.
So I thank you on our all behalf
Yes.
for having written it.
well, thank you. It's available in the form of an audiobook, as an ebook, a download, and hard copy and soft copy, and sold by Chapters and Indigo across Canada.
Very well. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.